Alpha King Cassian betrayed his Luna with her own sister, framed her for treason, and tried to take her children from her arms, never knowing that the woman he cast aside carried the one bloodline capable of tearing down his entire council and becoming queen of the most powerful kingdom north of his border. What would you do if the husband you trusted chose your sister, branded you a traitor in front of his own court, and gave the order to take your children out of your arms? Evelyn Hawthorne knelt beside the cold hearth of her husband's private chamber and picked up a red moonstone earring shaped like a crescent moon. The stone was still warm from someone's skin, and the scent of cedar cologne clung to the pillows behind her, thick enough to catch in her throat. She turned the earring over once in her palm, already knowing whose ears it belonged to, unaware that within the hour she would be standing in a black stone circle reserved for traitors, while the same sister who owned that earring reached for her crown. The dressing room door opened at her back before she could set the earring down. Celeste stepped out wrapped in Cassian's black robe, her hair still damp, and Cassian himself did not move from where he stood near the window, made no denial, offered no excuse. Only watched Evelyn with the flat patience of a man who had already decided how this evening would end. "He chose a woman who knows how to make an alpha feel like a king," Celeste said, and there was no shame in it, only something close to triumph. Evelyn set the earring on the table with a steadiness she did not feel. 8 years she had run this kingdom from behind her husband's throne, had fed its soldiers and buried its dead, and never once asked for the credit that went to his name instead of hers. And none of it had bought her a husband who would not do this to her in the room where their children had been born. She told him she would take Rowan and Ivy and demand a formal accounting of his broken vows before the full council. She had barely reached the door when it opened again and Lord Severin walked in, flanked by armed guards. A blood-signed letter already unfolded in his hand, his voice calm in the particular way of a man who had rehearsed this moment for a very long time. For 8 years, Evelyn had been the one who actually ran Stormhaven, though almost no one beyond the council chamber would have said so out loud. She managed the winter grain stores down to the last sack, negotiated with the smaller packs that depended on Stormhaven for protection, kept the supply routes moving for the border patrols, and made sure that every family who had lost a son or a husband to the last border skirmish still had food on the table through the coldest months. Cassian stood in front of the packs and accepted their gratitude. Reports she had drafted at midnight went out under his seal by morning, and defensive plans she had spent weeks refining were praised in the council hall as the Alpha King's own strategic gift. She had told herself for years that this was simply what a marriage looked like, when one partner ruled in public and the other held the kingdom together in private, and that the arrangement was fair because she had never wanted the throne for herself, only a safe world for her children. Rowan and Ivy were 7-year-old twins born within minutes of each other, but built from different clay. Rowan noticed things. He could describe days later the exact number of guards posted at a gate, or the precise moment his father's voice changed when he was lying. Ivy was different, more attuned to scent and feeling than fact, able to name an herb from 3 rooms away and wrinkle her nose at anything that smelled wrong to her, including more than once the bitter edge of a plant called moonroot that grew wild near the northern border and that every healer in Stormhaven had been trained to avoid. Evelyn had raised them both to trust what they noticed because she had learned the hard way that a household runs on the things people choose not to say. She still wore the plain silver pendant her mother had given her before she died, a small disc worn smooth from years against her skin. Her mother had never explained where it came from, only gripped Evelyn's hand hard enough to leave a mark and told her more than once never to let the Stormhaven Council examine it or even know it existed. Evelyn had worn it under her collar for so long that she had almost stopped wondering why. Lord Severin had sat at the head of that council since the death of Cassian's father, and in all that time he had never once treated Evelyn's competence as anything but a threat to be managed. He praised her efficiency to her face, and warned Cassian in private that a Luna who understood the machinery of the kingdom too well was a Luna who could one day decide she no longer needed her alpha to hold it together. He had a particular way of steering conversations back toward the old law, the proper order of things, the danger of letting a woman's influence grow past what a council could easily undo. Evelyn had noticed the pattern years ago, and had simply learned to work around it the way she worked around every obstacle that did not announce itself directly. Celeste had grown up 2 years behind her sister and had spent most of that time feeling like a shadow cast by someone else's shape. Their parents had trusted Evelyn first with the ledgers, with the harder decisions, with the responsibility that comes to the child who is simply born capable and never allowed to stop proving it. The pack had trusted Evelyn first, the healers had trusted Evelyn first, and eventually Cassian, whom Celeste had quietly wanted long before the betrothal was ever announced, had been given to Evelyn first as well. Celeste had built a private accounting of every time her sister was chosen over her, and it had sat in her long enough to calcify into something that no longer felt like jealousy so much as a debt she believed the world owed her. Evelyn's days had a shape to them that she rarely examined anymore. Mornings went to the grain ledgers, and the quiet arguments with quartermasters who wanted to shortchange the outer villages first. Afternoons went to the children, to Rowan's endless questions about troop movements, and Ivy's habit of arranging dried herbs on the windowsill by scent rather than by name. Evenings, more often than she liked to admit, went to waiting for a husband who had stopped needing her company even when he still needed her competence. She had built her sense of worth on being useful in a way no one could take from her, and it had not once occurred to her that a person could be made both indispensable and disposable in the very same household. 2 winters earlier, a border dispute between the Pharaoh and Ashgate packs had nearly ended in open bloodshed over a shared grazing valley. Neither side would concede, and Cassian had told the assembled alphas that he needed a week to consider the matter. A week Evelyn knew Stormhaven could not afford, with tempers already sharpened past patience. She had gone to both packs quietly that same night, not as the Alpha King's wife, but as the woman who had personally counted their dead after the last border skirmish and remembered every widow's name, and she had proposed a rotating season split that let each pack graze the valley in turn, according to which had lost more men keeping it safe from Lycan incursions the previous year. Both alphas had agreed within the hour, less because the arrangement was clever than because Evelyn had asked the one question Cassian never thought to ask either side: which of them was more afraid of losing face than losing land? Cassian announced the resolution to his council the next morning, as though the week of consideration he had asked for had produced it, and Severin praised the Alpha King's patience in front of the very alphas Evelyn had sat with until past midnight. She had said nothing then, the way she said nothing every time this happened, telling herself the peace mattered more than the credit, and it was only much later, kneeling in the wreckage of her own marriage with a stranger's earring in her palm, that she understood how many times she had traded her name for his comfort without ever once being asked if the trade was fair. Cassian's absences had grown gradually enough that Evelyn had almost been able to ignore them. A missed dinner here, a private council session there, more evenings spent behind closed doors with Severin than with his own children. On the 3rd night in a row that he did not come to sit with Rowan and Ivy before bed, Evelyn had gone looking for him, telling herself she only wanted to remind him what his own family looked like. She had not expected the earring on his floor, and she had not expected even less to find that the woman wearing its match was her own sister. Now standing in the wreckage of that discovery, with Lord Severin's guards filling the doorway and a blood-signed letter unfolding in his hands, Evelyn understood that none of this had happened by accident. Severin's face carried no surprise at finding her here, no confusion at the scene in front of him, only the settled patience of a man arriving exactly on schedule. He held the letter out where the firelight caught the dark red seal at its base, and he read from it in the unhurried voice of someone who had said these words to himself many times already in rehearsal. The letter accused Evelyn Hawthorne Luna of Stormhaven of exchanging secret correspondence with Theron Blackage, the Lycan King of Ironvale, and of conspiring with him to weaken Stormhaven's defenses in exchange for his help removing Cassian from the throne. It bore Severin set her own blood seal at the bottom, verified that same evening by 2 of his most trusted men. Evelyn had never in her life exchanged a single word with Theron Blackage. She said so plainly without raising her voice because she had learned long ago that panic was the first thing a room like this one waited to see. Cassian did not defend her. He stood by the cold hearth with his arms folded, watching his wife be accused of treason in the same room where an hour earlier he had let her discover his betrayal without offering a single word of denial, and his silence told her more plainly than any accusation could that whatever came next in this room had already been decided long before she walked into it. "Whatever quarrel exists between husband and wife," Severin said, folding the letter closed again, "is a private matter. Treason against the crown is not." Evelyn looked at the blood seal at the bottom of the letter and felt for the first time since she had picked up that small red earring, something colder than betrayal settle into her chest. It was not fear of the accusation itself. It was the certainty sharpening with every second Severin let the silence stretch that whoever had prepared this letter had known she would be standing in this exact room, at this exact hour, long before she ever knew it herself. Lord Severin convened the full council before midnight, and Evelyn was made to stand inside the black stone circle carved into the floor for the accused, still wearing the silver mantle of a Luna she had not yet been stripped of. Severin laid the blood-signed letter before the assembled alphas and produced a bribed messenger who swore he had seen her sending correspondence toward the Iron Vale border. Evelyn asked calmly that the blood signature be tested under the old oath verification rite that every council kept for exactly this purpose. Severin refused, citing the danger of delay, with an enemy kingdom possibly already informed. Cassian stood beside his own throne and said only that he could not let personal affection outweigh his duty as Alpha King and the Council, moving with a speed Evelyn had never once seen it move. For anything else, return 3 judgments before the hour was out. Her title as Luna would be suspended. She would be confined to the Northern Tower. Her guardianship of Rowan and Ivy would be removed pending a full treason trial, with the children placed instead in Celeste's care. Celeste stood near the edge of the chamber during the reading of the judgments, close enough to the council table that Evelyn could see she had already chosen which of the twins' rooms she meant to redecorate first. She did not bother to hide the satisfaction on her face, and that more than anything else that night was what finally emptied the last of the disbelief out of Evelyn's chest. This was not a husband's momentary weakness being managed quietly behind closed doors. This was a plan with a shape and a schedule, and every person in the room already knew their part in it except her. It was that last judgment more than the accusation itself that told Evelyn exactly what this had always been about. Before the council could seal the ruling in blood, she crossed to the Luna's ceremonial desk, pulled open the lower drawer, and took out the ritual knife kept there for the oldest of the old laws. She cut her own palm and pressed her blood to the sanctuary emblem carved into the center of the floor, and the mark burned to life beneath her hand as she invoked the 7-night sanctuary law, older than Cassian's line and older than Severin's council. Under that law, an accused Luna could claim 7 nights to gather evidence in her own defense. Any unfinished judgment against her would freeze where it stood. Any minor children still under her guardianship at the moment the law was invoked would remain with her, not with whoever the council preferred. No alpha could arrest her, wound her, or take her family from her by force during those 7 nights, and a neutral Grand Council had to be summoned before the 7th night ended. Because the ruling on guardianship had not yet been sealed, Rowan and Ivy were still legally hers when the mark ignited. One of the older council lords, a gray-muzzled alpha named Bram, who had served under Cassian's father, asked quietly whether the council intended to try a Luna for treason without first testing the blood that supposedly proved it. Severin answered before Cassian could, reminding Bram that a delay of even a single day could let a foreign king finish whatever plan this letter accused Evelyn of helping build. Bram did not press further. Though Evelyn saw him look away from the circle rather than meet her eyes, the particular shame of a man who suspected something was wrong and had decided it was safer not to ask what. Cassian accused her of hiding behind a law no one had invoked in a generation. Severin, watching the room more carefully than Cassian, was warned him quietly that breaking sanctuary openly in front of witnesses could cost Stormhaven its standing before the very council that would decide this case. Cassian let her walk out of the hall. He gave the order to seal every recognized gate before she reached them. Evelyn took Rowan and Ivy down through the old evacuation tunnel beneath the grain stores, a passage she had restored herself years earlier for exactly the kind of night she had never expected to need it. In the dark beneath the palace, her mother's pendant began to glow against her collarbone, faint at first, and then unmistakable, and by the time they reached the tunnel's end, 2 silver marks had risen on Rowan and Ivy's wrists, each shaped like half of a single crown split down the middle. Severin, watching from a window above, saw the light reflected off the tunnel's exit, and understood in that instant exactly what he had suspected for years about the bloodline behind that pendant. He turned to his trackers and told them not to let the children cross the border alive, to tell anyone what he now knew. The three of them came out beyond the palace walls with the sound of tracking wolves already rising behind them, and the 7-night countdown began in earnest. Ivy's hand was cold in Evelyn's grip, and Rowan kept looking back over his shoulder at the palace lights receding behind them. But neither child cried out, and neither asked her to explain what the mark on their wrists meant. There would be time for that later if there was a later at all. Ivy had gone quiet in the tunnel, the particular quiet Evelyn recognized from every time her daughter's senses caught something before there were words for it, and when they finally stopped to catch their breath beneath a stand of frost-bare oaks. Ivy pressed her face against Evelyn's ribs and asked whether the mark on her wrist meant she was not really Rowan's sister anymore, only some other thing wearing her face. Evelyn knelt in the cold leaves and told her daughter that a name written in blood generations back did not undo a single night of the two of them falling asleep in the same bed during a thunderstorm, that whatever the mark meant to the rest of the world, it changed nothing about who Ivy already was. Rowan, listening without seeming to, reached over and laced his fingers through his sister's without being asked the way he had done, since they were small enough to share a cradle, and Ivy's shoulders came down from around her ears by the smallest degree. Evelyn filed the moment away, the way she filed everything that mattered and could not be dealt with yet, and got them both back on their feet before the cold could settle any deeper into small bones that had already been asked to carry too much that night. Evelyn led the twins north, through the forest, away from the main road where every recognized gate belonged to men loyal to Cassian, toward an old military supply bridge that had connected Stormhaven to neutral ground since long before her marriage. Rowan noticed tracks pressed into the mud on both slopes of the trail and warned her they were being herded toward a narrow ravine on purpose. Ivy caught the bitter thread of moonroot on the wind before the first arrow ever left a bow, and by the time the trackers broke from the tree line without a word of warning or demand for surrender, Evelyn already knew what kind of hunt this was. They had been walking for nearly 2 hours by then, long enough that the palace lights had disappeared behind the ridgeline, and the only sound left was their own breathing and the occasional crack of a branch under Rowan's boot, which he corrected each time without being told. Evelyn kept her pace slow enough for small legs and fast enough to matter, counting landmarks from a map she had not looked at in years, and hoping her memory of it had not gone soft with disuse. The first arrow struck the trunk beside Rowan's head, close enough that he did not move for a full second afterward. Its shaft carried Cassian's black wolf crest, stamped into the metal near the fletching. Evelyn understood then that no one had sent these men to bring her back for trial. Someone had sent them to make sure she never reached one. She crushed a fistful of bitter root between her palms and rubbed it over all three of their throats to mask their scent, and she pushed the children through a narrow pass. She remembered from an old military map she had studied years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with saving her own children's lives. When a second arrow came for Ivy, Evelyn turned her body into its path and took the shaft through her own shoulder instead. The silver in it, laced with moonroot, refused to let the wound close the way any ordinary injury would have. She kept moving anyway, one hand pressed hard against the bleeding blood soaking into the side of her dress, because she remembered that the old bridge ahead still held its wartime demolition pins untouched since the last conflict with Ironvale. Twice more before the bridge, Ivy caught a warning sent early enough to save them, once steering them wide of a second nest of trackers waiting in a dry creek bed, and once pulling on Evelyn's sleeve hard enough to stop her from stepping into a snare wire strung low across the path. Evelyn had spent years teaching her daughter to trust her own senses over anyone else's reassurance, and she had never once expected that lesson to be the thing keeping all three of them alive by the time they reached the water. She reached the bridge and ordered Rowan and Ivy across first while she stayed behind to pull the pins free. Rowan refused to leave her side until he spotted a numbered fragment of metal broken off one of the arrows lodged in the wood nearby, and he snapped it loose and pocketed it before she could tell him not to bother. The first of the trackers reached the near end of the bridge as Evelyn pulled the final pin. The whole structure gave way into the ravine below, taking most of the pursuing wolves down with it, and the force of the collapse threw Evelyn onto the frozen ground on the far side, the world tilting sideways before it went dark at the edges. One tracker had survived the fall and climbed the broken ledge on the near side, already moving for Ivy. The marks on both children's wrists flared. At the same instant, a ring of silver light in the shape of a single crown split in two, and the burst of it threw the attacker backward into the rocks before it faded and left both twins trembling and drained. It was not invincibility, Evelyn understood, even half-conscious on the ground. It was a shield that answered only to real murderous intent aimed at her children, and it cost them something every time it woke. She was still trying to push herself upright when she heard horses, many of them, and the low sound of black armored soldiers moving with the kind of discipline that belonged to a real army rather than a hunting party. Rowan had already pulled Ivy behind him, small shoulders squared toward the noise, and Evelyn found she could not lift her arm high enough to shield them the way she wanted to. A man dismounted before the others, tall enough that his shadow fell over her before his face did, and when he crouched to examine the sanctuary mark, still glowing faint, on her wrist, Evelyn felt her chest turn over in a way she did not have a name for yet. A pull low and unfamiliar, entirely separate from the pain in her shoulder. "I am the king you are accused of conspiring with," he said in a voice that carried no accusation of its own, only the flat, measuring calm of a man deciding in real time whether the woman in front of him was a weapon aimed at his kingdom or the first true thing anyone had told him in years. Evelyn tried to answer him and found she had no strength left to manage it. The last thing she registered before the dark closed over her completely was the strange, steadying certainty that whatever came next, this man was not going to be the danger Severin's letter had promised he would be, and the unfamiliar pull in her chest did not feel like fear at all, which frightened her far more than the arrow wound ever could. Theron Blackage did not trust her. Not fully, not yet. The treason letter had named him directly, and a wounded woman arriving at his border with 2 marked children could just as easily be a trap set to let Stormhaven accuse Ironvale of harboring a rebel Luna as it could be the truth. But the sanctuary mark on her wrist was real, and the old law between werewolves and Lycans was older than either kingdom's grudges, and Theron had built his reign on the belief that a king who bent the law for his own convenience had already lost the right to enforce it against anyone else. "Ironvale will obey the law," he told his generals standing over Evelyn while healers worked the silver arrow free of her shoulder. "Not because I trust her, because the law has to stand above whatever anger I might be entitled to." He did not touch her wound or authorize the treatment until she had given her own consent through the haze of pain, a small thing that struck her harder than it should have after 8 years of a husband who had stopped asking her opinion on anything that mattered. He posted guards near the room where she and the twins slept, not to confine her, he made clear, but to protect a claimant under sanctuary law until the evidence proved her guilt or her innocence. And if it proved guilt, he told her plainly he would deliver her to the Grand Council himself rather than pass judgment on his own authority. It was during the treatment that Ironvale's aging priest first saw the marks risen on Rowan and Ivy's wrists, and the color left his face before he had even finished examining them. He called them the Twin Moon Crown, the blood sign of a dynasty called Moonbridge, that had vanished from the histories 2 generations before Evelyn was born, wiped so thoroughly from record that even the oldest family spoke of it only in warning, never in memory. The bloodline had run through Evelyn's mother, not through Cassian, and the pendant Evelyn had worn since childhood. Without ever being told its true name was a sealed Moonbridge insignia her mother had hidden precisely because so many people would have wanted to control what it represented. The priest's hands had trembled, taking the pendant from around Evelyn's neck to examine it more closely, and he told her that his own teacher, decades dead, now had once shown him a single drawing of the Moonbridge crest in a book that no longer existed, destroyed along with every other record of the dynasty during a purge so thorough that most Lycans alive today would have called the whole bloodline a fireside story rather than a fact of history. He asked her gently whether her mother had ever told her anything at all about where the family had come from, and Evelyn admitted that she had not, that she had spent her whole life assuming the pendant was simply an heirloom, with no more meaning than the silver it was cut from. The priest explained what little remained known of the Moonbridge line's power. Its blood carried the right to summon a joint council of werewolves and Lycans together in authority no single alpha or king could refuse. It carried the ability to expose a false blood oath during a proper ritual, stripping away any forged signature, no matter how well it had been copied. And it carried a shield temporary and costly that answered only when a minor heir of the bloodline faced direct murderous intent. It could not replace evidence, It could not make the twins untouchable. It was a key, the priest said, not a sword. Theron told her that same night that Ironvale had recently intercepted shipments of moonroot moving in quantities no legitimate trade route could explain, all of them originating from Stormhaven. He suspected someone was working to weaken Lycan defenses ahead of provoking a war nobody in Ironvale wanted, and Evelyn's name inside a forged letter naming him as her co-conspirator would be a remarkably efficient way to turn both kingdoms against each other at once. The alarm bells came before dawn. Dozens of soldiers and several children in the stronghold collapsed after eating from the royal grain stores, and Theron's own generals turned on Evelyn within the hour, certain the poisoned Luna of Stormhaven had brought her sickness across the border with her. Evelyn examined the fallen herself and understood immediately that the moonroot had never been mixed into the food. It had been ground fine and worked into the preservative powder rubbed along the seams of the grain sacks themselves, a method that left no trace in any cooked meal and would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not already know exactly what moonroot smelled like against old burlap. She checked every sack by hand and marked the contaminated ones, working through the storage yard in the gray hour before dawn while healers waited at her elbow for instructions instead of accusations, a small shift in how a room treated her that she noticed even in the middle of the crisis. She directed them to prepare an antidote from silvermint and laurel ash drawn from knowledge her own mother had passed down to her years before. Either of them understood why it might matter back when Evelyn had thought she was only learning which plants soothed a child's fever. The healers worked through the morning, grinding the mixture fine enough to dissolve, and Evelyn stayed at the bedside of the worst of the sickened children herself rather than delegate the hardest cases to anyone else. The remedy worked. Theron, dozens of his soldiers, and the sickened children all recovered by mid-morning, and Theron credited her publicly in front of his own council, without once trying to turn her rescue of his people into a debt she now owed him. Evelyn went further. She reviewed the transport records herself and found that every poison shipment had been routed through one of 3 specific mountain gates, and when she laid the pattern over Theron's own defensive maps, the conclusion was immediate and cold. If the garrisons at all 3 gates fell ill on the same night, a direct corridor into Ironvale's capital would open before anyone could organize a response. This had never been a scattering of isolated poisonings. It had been the opening move of an invasion timed to look like an accident. Theron verified her analysis against his own intelligence and offered her something Cassian never had: full access to the transport files and a place at the table as an independent advisor rather than a wife whose competence needed to be managed quietly out of sight. Evelyn accepted because the Moonroot network was the surest thread she had toward proving the conspiracy against her, and because for the first time in longer than she could remember, a king was listening to her the way he might listen to an equal. Rowan produced the numbered silver fragment he had pocketed at the bridge, and Ironvale's armorer confirmed within the hour that the number belonged to no arsenal under Cassian's official command. It traced instead to a private weapons store controlled directly by Lord Severin. Ivy, walking the stronghold storage yard, caught the bitter trace of moonroot on a transport wagon that had passed through Stormhaven days earlier, its axle sealed in wax, bearing Celeste's own family mark. Theron offered to send soldiers across the border to arrest Celeste and Severin outright. Evelyn refused. A Lycan military strike into Stormhaven would let Severin recast this entire conspiracy as a foreign invasion with her own family's names buried under the noise of it. She wanted evidence gathered and presented before the Grand Council in the open, where no one could later claim the outcome had been forced by an army rather than proven by the truth. Theron did not argue with her. He simply agreed, and the tension across Evelyn's shoulders eased slightly at being trusted with a decision this large, without having to fight for the right to make it. Stormhaven, in the meantime, was coming apart without her. Grain went to the wrong villages. Soldiers' widows stopped receiving the rations Evelyn had quietly guaranteed them for years. Smaller packs, insulted by Celeste's handling of a dispute Evelyn would have settled in an afternoon, began withholding the soldiers they owed the crown. Celeste spent her days choosing coronation robes and removing every servant she suspected of loyalty to her sister, and Cassian, watching his kingdom fray at the edges he had never bothered to notice before, began to understand exactly how much of Stormhaven's stability had been built by the wife he had thrown away. Celeste announced not long after that she carried Cassian's child and pressed for her coronation to be moved forward before the Grand Council could interfere. The royal healer, questioned privately by a member of Cassian's own guard, finally broke and confessed that Celeste had never been pregnant at all, that she had used tinctures to mimic the symptoms and bribed a servant to falsify the examination because she understood that Cassian could not easily discard Evelyn for good without an heir already on the way to replace the two he already had. Cassian confronted her, and Celeste reminded him without flinching that although Severin had slipped him something the night of their first encounter, he had woken sober the morning after and chosen freely to continue what had started. He could have confessed then. He could have sent her away. Instead, he had protected his own reputation and let his wife be framed for a crime she had never committed, and Celeste made him say it out loud once before she walked away from him. Word of the seventh night's approaching deadline reached both courts within the same day, carried by the same old law that had once seemed to Evelyn a relic no living alpha would ever have cause to invoke. Ironvale's council debated openly in front of her whether a summoned Grand Council under a name 2 generations erased from the histories could even be considered lawful, and Theron silenced the argument by reminding his own lords that the law existed precisely to survive, being inconvenient to whoever currently held power. Runners were dispatched to the neutral pacts, required to seat the tribunal, each one carrying Theron's personal seal alongside Evelyn's, a small detail that struck several of the older Lycan lords as unusual enough to comment on a foreign Luna's mark riding beside their kings on a summons of this weight. Evelyn used the waiting days to write out in her own hand a full accounting of the transport routes, the silver fragment's origin, and the wax seal's ownership, certain that a spoken account alone would not survive Severin's talent for reframing inconvenient truths into someone else's treason. Severin pressed forward with the coronation regardless, insisting that Stormhaven needed a Luna in place before the Grand Council could use the vacancy against them. Celeste placed the ancestral Luna ring on her finger in front of the assembled court, and because Cassian's mate bond with Evelyn had never been broken, and Celeste's oath was built on a lie. From its very first word, the ring burned across her hand. Silver cracks split its band before it fell from her finger and threw for one unmistakable instant a faint image of Evelyn standing accused in the black stone circle on the night this had all begun. The entire court watched the ring reject her, and no one in that hall could pretend afterward that they had not seen it. Cassian went looking for answers in the one place he had never let himself question before, the weapons store hidden beneath Severin's own estate. He found silver arrows there stamped with the same numbering system that had marked the shaft pulled from Rowan's tree, and buried among the ledgers he found the order he himself had signed, its wording quietly altered from "Bring her back to be certain she does not return." He understood, standing there with the forged order in his hands, that his own failure had made every part of this possible. He had seen the gates sealed and asked no questions. He had watched Severin refuse a simple blood test and said nothing. He had known on some level he had refused to examine that Celeste was lying to him from the very beginning, and he had let her keep lying because the alternative meant admitting what kind of man he had chosen to become. He sat alone with the altered order for a long time before he moved again, turning it over the way a man turns over a wound to see how deep it actually runs. He thought of every small moment he had waved away over the past months. Severin's insistence on handling matters personally, the guards who answered to the council before they answered to their king, the ease with which an accusation against his own wife had moved through a process that should have taken weeks in a single night. He had told himself he was simply a busy king trusting a capable advisor. He understood now that he had been a convenient figurehead for a man who had spent years building the machinery to remove him the moment it was no longer useful to keep him standing. Behind the armory he found a sealed chamber holding maps charted for an invasion of Ironvale, crates of moonroot packed for transport plans marked against the same 3 mountain gates Evelyn had already identified, and a list written in Severin's own hand of names to be removed once the war began. Evelyn's name stood first on it. Rowan's and Ivy's names stood second. His own name was written last. Severin's plan laid bare on that page had never been only about removing an inconvenient Luna. Eliminate Evelyn before her bloodline could unmake his council. Install Celeste, a Luna who would need him for everything and question him for nothing. Poison Ironvale, provoke a war neither kingdom wanted. Let Cassian fall in the fighting he had been maneuvered into, and take the regency for himself once there was no one left with a stronger claim. Celeste had played her part, believing it would finally make her the one the world chose first, never once suspecting that Severin had written her own name onto a second list to be dealt with once she had served her purpose, and Stormhaven no longer needed the fiction of her Luna throne. At Ironvale, Evelyn and Theron followed the Moonroot transport route back to an abandoned border station and found the man who had forged the blood signature on the treason letter, a quiet, frightened craftsman who confessed everything the moment he understood what Severin's failure would cost him if he stayed loyal to a losing side. Severin had obtained genuine blood from a cloth Evelyn had used tending Rowan through a fever months earlier, then bound it to a copying seal precise enough to pass any ordinary verification. The forger would not meet her eyes while he spoke, ashamed less of the crime itself, it seemed, than of how easily Severin had used a piece of her own kindness against her. The cloth from Rowan's sickbed turned into the very proof of her supposed betrayal. Evelyn told him she did not forgive what he had done, only that she understood how a frightened man could be made into a tool by someone patient enough to wait for the right kind of desperation. And the tightness in his shoulders finally loosened at being told the truth plainly, instead of either absolved or condemned. Theron had him placed under Ironvale's protection rather than handed back across the border on the condition that he testify before the Grand Council when the time came. Evelyn walked away from that station with the transport ledger, Severin's private seal, the written order naming her children, the forger's sworn confession, and a damaged memory crystal that held only a fragment of a conversation between Severin and Celeste. Not enough on its own to convict either of them, but enough to prove that Celeste had known long before the ring burned her hand exactly whose life this conspiracy had been built to end. The night before the Grand Council convened, Evelyn admitted to Theron that facing Cassian again frightened her more than facing any verdict the Council might hand down. Some smaller, stubborn part of her still grieved the marriage she had believed in for 8 years, and she hated that part of herself even as she could not make it stop. "You don't have to stop hurting before you're allowed to move forward," Theron told her. "You only have to stop letting the hurt decide who you are." He told her, too, that he had known her name for years before he ever met her. Through the shape of the defensive strategies Stormhaven's reports had always credited to Cassian's strategies that carried a pattern of thinking he recognized now as unmistakably hers. He did not ask her for a mate bond. He did not ask her to become anything to him at all. He offered only to stand beside her when she faced the Council if that was what she wanted, and nothing more than that. The 6th night of Sanctuary ended as they rode for the Stormhaven border. Theron's army arrayed behind them, not as an invading force, but as an escort at Evelyn's own insistence, so that whatever happened next could never be recast as Ironvale seizing a kingdom by the sword. Cassian was waiting alone at the gate when they arrived, and he told her plainly before she had even dismounted that Severin knew she was coming and intended to turn the Grand Council into a massacre rather than let the evidence be heard. Evelyn walked into Stormhaven's great hall wearing the plain silver mantle of a Moonbridge lawkeeper rather than the Luna robes she had once worn there with Rowan and Ivy at her side, and Theron a pace behind her, present as a legal witness and protector under sanctuary law, not as a man making her choices for her. Before the assembled Alphas, Lycan lords, and neutral pack representatives, she laid out the evidence one piece at a time: the numbered silver fragment from Severin's hidden arsenal, the Moonroot transport ledger, the forger's sworn testimony, Severin's own seal, the written order naming her children, the wax mark tying Celeste to a poison shipment, the damaged memory crystal. The forged treason letter was placed inside the ceremonial circle at the center of the hall, and when Rowan and Ivy's marks ignited above it, the false blood oath separated cleanly from Evelyn's true signature, the copied seal collapsing into visible fracture lines that any council member could see for themselves. Bram the Grey, muzzled lord, who had questioned Severin once already and let himself be silenced, rose from his seat without being asked and said loud enough for the whole hall to hear that he had suspected this very possibility on the night of the first trial and had said nothing, and that his own silence had been its own kind of failure. Other lords who had voted for Evelyn's suspension without a second thought began shifting where they sat, the particular discomfort of men realizing how easily their trust had been directed exactly where someone else wanted it to go. Severin rose, immediately accusing her of manipulating ancient magic to fabricate the very evidence she claimed to have found, and demanded that Cassian arrest her on the spot before the council could be swayed further. Cassian stepped down from the throne instead. He confessed to the entire hall that he had betrayed his wife with her own sister, that he had known even before the affair began that Severin had drugged him the first night with Celeste, and that he had chosen afterwards sober and clear-headed to continue it anyway rather than confess and lose the comfortable image of himself he had built. That he had allowed Severin to deny Evelyn a basic blood test he had no honest reason to refuse. That he had known the gates were sealed against a wife under lawful sanctuary and had done nothing to stop it. That he had failed her as a husband, failed his children as a father, and failed Stormhaven as its king, and that none of it could be undone now by a single confession delivered too late to matter to the people it had already hurt. He renounced any remaining claim over Evelyn in front of the full council and submitted his authority to their judgment rather than his own. Rowan stood close enough to his mother during the reading of the evidence that Evelyn could feel him counting the guards along the walls the way he had once counted them at a palace gate, a habit she had taught him without meaning to, and that now, watching him do it in a hall full of men who might yet turn violent, she almost wished she had discouraged. Ivy kept her eyes on Celeste rather than on the evidence table, and when Evelyn asked her afterward what she had been searching for, Ivy said only that she had been waiting to see if her aunt's face would change once the truth was said out loud in front of everyone, because a person's scent shifted when a lie finally stopped being worth telling. Celeste was brought forward next, and she did not try to defend herself the way Cassian expected her to. She admitted in front of the entire hall that she had spent her whole life in her sister's shadow and had believed that taking Cassian the Luna throne and an invented child would finally make her the one chosen first. Then she told them what she had only just learned herself, that Severin's list of names to be erased once the war began had included her own filed just beneath Cassian's, and her expression changed the moment the words left her mouth. Whatever loyalty she had felt toward Severin died in that instant, and she turned on him in open counsel, confirming everything Evelyn's evidence had already shown. Severin raised one hand, and the great doors of the hall slammed shut on their own iron chains. Guards loyal only to him drew silver weapons from beneath their cloaks, and somewhere below the floor hidden moonroot canisters began venting into the ventilation shafts that fed the entire chamber. "This council," Severin said, his voice finally shedding every trace of patience it had worn for years, "will end tonight with no witness left alive to dispute the record I choose to leave behind." Severin's assassins went for Rowan and Ivy first, exactly as he had planned, meaning to break the twins' Moonbridge blood and use it to unmake the very laws protecting the hall. When the first blade closed on Ivy, the twin moon crown answered again, a shield of silver light thrown up between her and the attacker. Though both children swayed on their feet, the instant it faded, drained past anything a body their size should have to bear. Theron did not order Evelyn back from the fight. He trusted her knowledge of the palace more than he trusted anyone else in that hall, and he let her direct the evacuation of the council members and the younger pack representatives while his own warriors broke against Severin's guards at the doors. Evelyn traced the venting moon root to its source in the floor below and ordered the shafts broken open by hand, the poison bleeding harmlessly into open air instead of into the lungs of everyone trapped above. Cassian threw himself between Rowan and a silver spear meant for the boy's chest and took the wound meant for his son instead, dropping hard against the stone with blood already spreading beneath him. "You knew they wanted to hurt us," Rowan told him, kneeling close enough that only his father could hear it. "And you still didn't believe Mother until it was almost too late." Cassian did not answer because there was no answer that would have made it less true, and he understood, bleeding on the floor of the hall he had ruled for 8 years. That one wound taken in his children's defense could not undo everything he had failed to defend before it. Severin turned the ritual knife on Ivy himself when his guards began to fall, and Evelyn met him before the blade closed the distance standing between her daughter and the man who had tried to end both her children's lives twice in the same week. When Severin shouted over the chaos that he now held supreme authority over a council with no lawful head left standing to oppose him, the twin moon crown answered a final time, and the oath he tried to claim collapsed the instant he spoke it. The council insignia stripped visibly from the air around him as every witness in the hall watched it happen. Theron reached him before the knife could fall again, disarming him without killing him. Because Evelyn had asked before they ever crossed back into Stormhaven that Severin answer for this in front of a council rather than die quietly enough for the truth to die with him. The Grand Council's judgments came before the sun rose. Severin was stripped of every title, every holding, and every guard who had ever answered to his name and delivered to a neutral fortress to stand trial for treason, poisoning, conspiracy, and the attempted murder of 2 minor heirs. Celeste lost her place in Stormhaven, entirely exiled from its borders and barred forever from Moonbridge territory, though she left the hall alive, which was more mercy than the plan she had helped build had ever offered anyone else. Cassian's authority as Alpha King was suspended and handed to an interim council until Stormhaven could stand again on something steadier than his judgment. Evelyn was cleared of every accusation the forged letter had ever carried. Rowan and Ivy were recognized as heirs of the Twin Moon Crown, though no one in that hall asked 2 7-year-olds to rule anything before they had finished growing up. Evelyn turned to Cassian once the judgments had been read and told him plainly that one oath still stood unresolved between them, and that she intended to end it herself rather than let it linger the way everything else in this marriage had been allowed to linger unspoken for years. The legal divorce was signed before the full council within the week. Cassian surrendered every forced claim to guardianship over Rowan and Ivy, free now to see them only if the twins themselves chose someday to allow it. Paper alone could not touch the deeper bond, though the one built into blood and instinct rather than treaties. And so, beneath the twin moons, Evelyn and Cassian stood together one final time inside the old ritual circle. Cassian apologized without asking to be forgiven, understanding at last that forgiveness was not owed to him simply because he had finally found the courage to say the words out loud. Evelyn told him she had loved him honestly once, and that love could not survive what dignity, trust, and safety had all been asked to survive in its place. She took up the same ritual knife that had once opened her palm to invoke sanctuary, cut it open again, and spoke the words that severed a bond 8 years in the making. "I am not giving up on love," she said. "I am giving up the power your betrayal has held over me since the night I found that earring." The bond broke cleanly, and Cassian felt her warmth, her voice, her presence leave the place inside him where it had lived since the day they were first bound, and whatever punishment the council had not already handed him, he carried that absence as its own sentence for the rest of his life. Evelyn did not marry again right away. For months she served Ironvale as its lawkeeper and as Stormhaven's Moonbridge representative, rebuilding grain routes on both sides of the border, establishing an oath verification standard no council could quietly ignore again, and giving Rowan and Ivy a childhood built around choices instead of politics. Theron stood beside her through all of it, without once pressing her toward anything more than she was ready to give, treating her children as people with their own futures rather than heirs to be spent. Rowan and Ivy grew steadier with every season that passed, without a crisis demanding their blood or their fear, and it was Ivy who noticed first, the way she noticed everything that mattered before anyone said it aloud, that their mother's shoulders no longer carried the particular tightness she used to wear into every council meeting at Stormhaven. Rowan asked Theron directly with the bluntness only a child who had once counted guards at a trader's gate could manage, whether he intended to marry their mother or simply keep standing near her forever without saying so. Theron answered him honestly, telling the boy that he did not intend to ask Evelyn anything until he was certain she wanted it for herself, and not simply because a Lycan King's protection was safer than facing the world alone. And Rowan considered this answer seriously enough that he later told Ivy he thought Theron might actually be worth trusting with something as important as their mother's heart. He asked her finally at the rebuilt bridge where she had once nearly died, pulling the pins that saved her children's lives, whether she would choose to build a kingdom beside him. "I don't want to make you my queen," he told her. "You were already a queen before I ever met you. I only want to know if you'll choose to stand next to me while you keep being one." She said yes, because for the first time since a red moonstone earring had changed the entire shape of her life, the choice belonged completely to her. At Ironvale's coronation, Evelyn became Queen Consort, Moonbridge Lawkeeper, protector of the Twin Moon Crown, and Theron's equal in every decision that would follow. Rowan and Ivy placed the crown on their mother's head themselves, and Theron knelt before her before either of them knelt before the watching hall. Cassian stood somewhere in that crowd, watching the woman he had once treated as replaceable become queen of the most powerful kingdom north of the border he used to guard, and Evelyn did not look for his face among the others. She had already stopped needing him to witness what she had built without him. If you have ever been the one who held everything together while someone else took the credit for it, may this be the story that reminds you dignity was never a crown that anyone else could hand you or take away. It begins the moment you stop waiting for the person who betrayed you to finally see your worth and choose yourself instead. If this story found you at the right moment, stay close. There is another one waiting just ahead.